Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I am Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we are at the end of chapter 11 of our book, Faith Has Its Reasons, and we are concluding our look at the evidentialist model of apologetics. And so throughout this book, we're looking at 4 and then technically 5 different apologetic methods: classicalist, the evidentialist, the reformed epistemology, and which is presuppositionalism, and then we're looking at theism, and then we're looking at kind of the author's take on kind of the model that they wish to propose to us after looking at these 4. And we're coming down to looking at the last bit from our authors on the evidentialist, which is looking at both the strengths that they view for the evidentialist and also the weaknesses. So here we're going to kick off initially with what our authors view as kind of the reason to hold to these positions the most, and showing exactly why it's so appealing to a number of people, especially coming off of kind of the classicalist model. You know, why reinvent the wheel if the classicalist model seemed to have worked for all these years of history? Well, the evidentialist has these points, maybe not against it, but in support of it. Well, as they did in the Classical Apologists in Chapter 7, they're going to here review the most common and important observations that have been made as the notable strengths and potential weaknesses of the evidentialist model.
Right. And I think they give us 3 of each here. So we'll kind of work through each of these point by point. So the first one is with regard to the notable strengths. So we have notable strengths and we have notable weaknesses, right? So notable strengths. The first notable strength is that the evidentialists recognize that probability is unavoidable. Probability is unavoidable. Evidentialists readily admit that the conclusions available through the inductive process of historical inquiry are probable and not certain, right? So when we look at history, we're looking at probability as opposed to, deductive certainty. But they are quick to add that no decision in life is based on deductive certainty, right? None of our, even for me to sit in this chair, it's basically a probability argument because, I can't say it will, I have proof that it will hold me this time. No, not really. It could fall apart the next time I sit in it, right? So their claim here is that no decision in life is based on deductive certainty, right? All of them are probability decisions. Deduction, they argue, can reveal whether a conclusion follows from specific premises, but it cannot tell us whether premises correspond to the truth about the real world. Right. So, yes, deductive arguments can say if these premises are true, and there's a key, then the conclusion is true. But the deductive argument doesn't necessarily tell us whether or not the conclusions are true. And so in all matters of fact, the evidentialists maintain we are dependent on human observation and human interpretation. And of course, both of them are fallible. Right. So the first strength that our authors, Bowman want to point out is that the evidentialist recognizes that probability is unavoidable. This is how we run our everyday lives. And they want us to see that with regard to this approach.
Right. Yep. Everything is this kind of risk assessment. And so whether it be with driving a car or with where to invest money, you're taking an inductive risk. And so we're having to do that even with what we can kind of consider our base truth claims as well. Well, the second one for the strengths coming off of the probability positivity is that it appeals the appealing method of inquiry. One of the great strengths of the evidentialist approach is the use of the methods of inquiry already familiar and acceptable to many non-Christians. And so since the goal of apologetics is to persuade people that Christianity is true, or at least that it is reasonable to believe it is true, arguments that employ strategies familiar to those being persuaded are so much more likely to be effective. And so when we talked about all the different lawyers or all the different detectives. We've had one on the show before who present the case to make the claims and to try and persuade and convince you the idea of God in the dock and from C.S. Lewis. All these kind of parallels to our normal lives are how we make big, important decisions, whether the state should take your life, whether it should restrict your liberty, whether or not to be properly informed is, you want this more than preponderance of the evidence. You want beyond a reasonable doubt to have belief. And in there, you see the probability argument as well. And so it is undeniable that evidential apologetics has enjoyed great success because of this, because we know those things like evidence demands a verdict more than a carpenter. We've got J. Warner Wallace and various other people like C.S. Lewis and John Warwick Montgomery, to just name a few, who have put out books and different avenues of arguments. You have different scientists who are putting out responses against atheistic Darwin philosophy and kind of showing why that doesn't come about without a common designer in the mix. Those are the things that are being appealed to by the evidentialist, and it's what's familiar in the lives of people who make decisions based on those types of kind of argumentation.
Right. So they say, we're going to argue in the way that everybody argues so that we have kind of common ground with regard to our approach, right? That's the basic idea. And so that's what our book is suggesting is a strength, the appealing methods of inquiry. All right. And then thirdly, the third strength they point out is that evidentialist stresses this particular approach, stresses the factual evidence, right? And of course, that's why I call it evidentialist, right? If the goal of the Christian apologetics is to defend the truth of Christianity, and if truth is understood as correspondence with reality, right? That's the kind of the correspondence theory of truth. Then an apologetic that emphasizes the factual reality of Christianity is mandatory, right? Evidentialism is defined by the primacy that it assigns to fact, right? So they stress the factual evidence as a way of showing the truth of Christianity. Truth must be factually based, they argue, and Christian truth then can be verified by objective public evidence that's available to everyone, right? So they stress the factual evidence. So it's not all, philosophical arguments, pie in the sky, analytical type of thing. Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts.
Right. And so those are big positives for the evidentialist model, especially for your evangelism, for speaking to just not so much the person on whatever social media platform, but just to your neighbor and just to the normal everyday person that you're meeting. It's not so much to go, well, let's look at premise one. Premise one says this, and then from the conclusion, this. No, it's just, hey, let me tell you about what has changed my life, and let's point to, we know that Jesus existed. We know that he lived in Galilee. We know that his apostles stayed with him for this number of years. And then once he died, something happened where they continued to preach his message. And so that has a lot of appealing factors to just normal everyday conversations that you have. And so we shouldn't shy away from that type of approach, because ultimately we're not appealing to apologetics within the test tubes and the pillars of academia solely. And so we want to give credence there as well. Well, unfortunately, with every positive, there is a weakness, even for the evidentialists. Although when we get to other methods, weaknesses are going to be interesting. So we're looking forward to that. But here, the weaknesses potentially is that evidential apologetics has been widely criticized from a number of perspectives. And so here's where our authors will consider some of the most common and important criticisms identifying potential weaknesses in or challenges to the evidentialist approach.
Right. So let's kind of dive into this. And again, there are three of these. And so we'll work our way through these. So the first one is that evidentialists in this particular methodology and approach assumes the theistic worldview. They assume the theistic worldview, right? Now, the principal objection, they tell us, to evidentialism from a classical apologetics perspective is that it attempts to make a case for the theistic worldview on the basis of facts. According to both classical apologists and most reformed apologists, which we'll get to next time, this will not work, right? One must first have a worldview before one can interpret the facts in the world. So you have to have a view of the world before then you understand how the facts fit with that particular view of the world, right? Norman Geisler, who we looked at when we were looking at classical apologetics, put it this way. He says, facts and evidence have ultimate meaning only within and by virtue of the content and context, rather, of the worldview in which they are conceived, right? So facts have meaning, events have meaning with regard to the contexts with which they are conceived. He adds that meaning is not inherent in historical facts and events. Meaning demands an interpretive context that is distinct from the facts and the evidence, right? So if I see a particular rock, one person might argue, well, that rock is a result of millions and millions of years of, all kinds of geological, operations that happen on that rock. And somebody else might say, no, I think it's just, a few thousand years old, right? And so you have to look at the worldview, the context, in order to interpret the so-called fact that you're looking at. Right. And so that's the criticism here. It kind of assumes a theistic worldview.
Right. Which may not always be a negative, but here, within the context of the evidentialist, it is seems to be the negative. And so, when we talk about, even looking at the resurrection, right? So here's the claims by a man who says, I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one can come to the Father except through me. I'm the Christ. I am the Lord of the Sabbath, all these things. And if you put your faith in me, then I will forgive your sins and pay for them. And you will have my righteousness imputed to you fully and completely. And then he dies and rises again. Well, does that necessarily follow that what happened, even though he claimed to come about, is exactly true? Can we trust that just because he was truthful in I will die and rise again is also true in that he'll pay for your sins? Well, it doesn't seem necessarily to follow completely. In the ever expanding universe where even the universe itself can come from nothing, even a person could just be really, really lucky in saying that I will die and rise again, and it just so happens he does. We just haven't figured out the natural course of events that made that possible. But people win the lottery all the time. And so here's just a big lottery. All right. So our second
And by the way, let me just say this with regard to the first approach here. This is why the classical, as we saw when we examined classical apologetics, that they spend a lot of time defending a particular Christian worldview and attacking a non-Christian worldview, right? Because they want to make sure that once we get this worldview perspective, then we can, interpret the various facts that we find.
Right. So the second one is that it uses hidden presuppositions. Oh, this sounds familiar. Well, critics of evidentialism contend that evidentialists work with hidden presuppositions about the nature of reality. For example, in their scientific and historical arguments, evidentialists presuppose that there is a rational structure to the whole of reality. Well, that's a big thing to smuggle in. The entirety of reality is smuggled in under this guise of your evidence. Oh, that's weird. The heuristic methodological assumptions that knowledge is possible, that the universe is structured, and that the senses can be trusted cannot themselves be empirically sustained. So that might
Right.
sound put your note here, and then wait for next chapter and see if this is truly a negative. Maybe it's not.
Yeah.
Maybe this is something that everyone does.
Right. So they kind of have hidden presuppositions that they don't defend, right? Where do you get the fact that the census can be trusted? How do you argue for that, right? You haven't done that. You're just assuming that they can be trusted. And based on that assumption now, here is a fact that you find, right? And so, so that hidden presuppositions. Now, evidentialists, our book tells us, are generally unmoved, quite frankly, by these concerns. They freely acknowledge that evidentialist arguments require certain assumptions about the reality of our physical world and the ability of the mind to perceive reality and the like. What the evidentialist wants is to not make arguments that are totally free of presuppositions, but rather arguments that presuppose only, and here it is, what must be presupposed to know anything at all. And so this challenge to the evidentialist approach then identifies a real limitation, our book suggests here, of the approach, but one which evidentialists insist everyone must live with, in order to know anything or reason about anything.
Right.
So everybody does this, so we can too. Leave us alone.
Right. Exactly. Well, and if you listen to Habermas, the minimal facts approach is kind of this. He's saying, listen, just give me these. I think is it 6 or 7 base facts, and from here, any normal working person with these minimal facts would almost have to conclude, if they're being as objective as they can within the court of law or being fair, that Jesus died, rose again, and was observed by other people to such a degree that we can be as confident with that as we can that George Washington was the first president of the United States. So even there, they're attempting to say, okay, that's all true. We have these base assumptions, but so do you. And so just give me these things, and then from there I can prove the whole thing. And we can quibble about, how many apostles there were or what have you. So yes, that's something that they're bringing in, but also that still seems to be kind of a negative here. All right, and then we're on to the final weakness that our authors have brought up here in the evidentialist model, and that it underestimates the human factor. Well, both classical and evidentialist apologists are often criticized for an excessive optimism in assuming that unbelievers are willing and able to examine the evidence of Christianity in an open, honest, and unprejudiced way. People have their biases, and sometimes you can't get over it. In fact, when voir dire happens for juries, this is exactly what is a step in the process to help mitigate that. Well, what happens when you have to preach to the whole world? Well, you can't just isolate people. You have to preach to the whole world. And so the goal for the evidentialists, non-reformed, is that everyone is able to come in and approach the message of the gospel and accept it. And so how does that factor in when someone who is completely closed off, whether for just good reasons, they've been tortured by bad people in the church, or they've had bad interactions with dishonest people who claim to be Christians, and so that prejudices their way. Well, how do you overcome that if you're just kind of trying to lay out the evidence? What more evidence are you going to stack on top of it that will have this Christian dove movie moment where they can't do anything other than what's written on the page for them? That seems to be the issue. Well, empirically oriented apologists in particular are said to place too much confidence in the persuasive value of evidences and erroneously assume a stance of historical objectivity, forgetting that the significance of historical facts is in fact determined by one's presuppositional framework. And again, you're seeing that a lot these days when it comes to kind of the reconstruction of different periods of history, where these are the things that we were taught in school, and the big names have written books on it. Well, revisionists have come through and say, well, it might not be as clear as what we think about when it comes to, the Roaring Twenties or post World War II or even the Civil War. And so we need to understand that sometimes that objective framework is getting lost in one's worldview and how one approaches it.
Right, exactly. So not only are they criticized for an excessive optimism and assuming that unbelievers, are willing and able to examine the evidence, but along similar lines, our author tells us evidentialists are accused of unrealistically minimizing the effects of sin on unregenerate cognitive and volition, right? In other words, they dismiss or at least minimize the effect of sin on how people think and the decisions that they make. So according to critics, for instance, Montgomery and others overestimate the ability of the unbeliever, in Montgomery words, to understand the factual nature of the world and rationally interpret the data of his experience. Now, they do point out that some evidentialists acknowledge the effects of sin on human reasoning, and they appeal to the common, though, and special grace of God in overcoming these cognitive and volitional barriers, right? But it's there, and so that's a criticism that our authors want us to be aware of. You kind of, unrealistically minimize the effects of sin on the unregenerate. In other words, you're preaching to, as the scriptures say, dead people, right? And you're expecting dead people to understand the facts and that sort of thing, right? And so if that's the case, that you need to take that into consideration. And the critique here is that they minimize that.
It almost seems like a certain type of miracle has to happen for those dead men to get up and be able to listen. So
yeah.
All right. Well, those were the positives and the weaknesses. What's the conclusion? What can we conclude from this? Well, so far, our authors have examined two models of apologetics, the classical and the evidentialist model. And in some ways, these two models are very similar. So if you want to quibble on, well, this, you've got your evidentialist and my classicalist. You've got your classicalist and my evidentialist. We're all Reese's Pieces within this side of the method. And so both methods attempt to make a case for the truth of Christianity that will be accessible to non-Christians who follow the argument openly and honestly. But the two strategies share a common understanding of the apologetic task that commending the Christian faith to non-Christians on the basis of truth that they already believe. And so that's where they have kind of that similarity that you might notice. Our authors are bringing that forefront here.
Right. And so, our author suggested it's this very understanding of apologetics is at the heart of many of the criticisms made by both models, right? In other words, we're just trying to appeal to the common things that everybody will hold to and that everybody believes, right? And so that kind of, as we will see here, is going to be challenged in some of these other approaches, right? Such an understanding has been urged, it has been urged that it fails to take into account the great disparity between the Christian and the non-Christian mindsets, right? These are the facts that everybody can believe or that they can hold to, or this is the method that everybody uses, and therefore we'll go from there, right? Except the issue here is there is a disparity between the Christian and the non-Christian mindset. So that's the point that our authors want us to see.
Right.
And so these two models, many apologists now believe, both assume that Christianity can be proved to non-Christians on their own terms, right? That is, on the non-Christians' terms, without challenging the non-Christians' most basic assumptions or presuppositions. And so to correct this faulty assumption, a third model of apologetics, which our authors called reformed apologetics, has been developed. And it's reformed apologetics then that we'll kind of take a look at next time, right? Mm-hmm. So the criticism here is, why do we need reformed apologetics? And the answer is because you're making too many assumptions about what people are able to do, right? which is kind of interesting because that's kind of the claim that goes against reform apologetics, right? You're assuming too much. You're making too many presuppositions, right?
Right.
But we'll see how that works out as we look at this this third model that they want to share with us.
Yeah, and it should be noted too that they do it historically, I think, as well, with a classicalist, then evidentialist, then reform, then with fideism. And fideism is definitely within that time frame with reformed as well. But it's the grouping of those tends to make logical sense. In fact, the 5 views of apologetics from Crosspoint series from Crossway that we allude to a number of times in comparison with this book also has that type laid out where you have kind of the 2, kind of 3 more traditional ideas of apologetics, and then more the reformed presuppositional models following as well. And so our authors are in good camp here, and so that's one of the reasons why we like it laid out like this as well. All right, well, we've done classicalists, we've done evidentialists, and now we're not going to try and get too giddy when we go towards the reform perspective, the presuppositional model, and we'll do that next time. So if you're keep interested in what we're talking about, pick up the book "Faith Has Its Reasons" by Kenneth Boa and Robert M. Bowman Jr., and all the links are available to you. And then keep checking out the other books that we've done, givethecross.com for all those, your traditional podcatchers, and also both YouTube and Rumble, and I think Odyssey is still having us as well. So we'll say thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.